I'm Ellen Alston, chaplain here at Hendrix College. Whether you are here with us in person or joining us online, welcome to our special event, Dismantling Racism, Embracing a New Tomorrow, with esteemed guest, Douglas Blackman, whom I will be introducing shortly. But first, we have a word of welcome from Hendrix College President Ellis Arnold.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled that you're here. Well, I'd like to especially welcome those of you that are here present with us today and also those that are joining us remotely. I also want to give a special word of thanks to the Central District of the Arkansas Conference of the United Methodist Church for the grant to help support today's event. Their shared focus with ours on dismantling racism, and we appreciate their support in helping to make today possible. And I especially want to thank Doug for being here today, returning to his alma mater. He hadn't been here just for today, but he was also here yesterday. And some of you may have had a chance to visit with him either in the Career Services offices or the Hendrix Murphy House, or maybe even in a history class yesterday. So, Doug, thank you for giving us so much time this weekend. We're very grateful. And a final word of thanks to Ellen Alston, our chaplain, and Lori Mulhern in the chaplain's office for all they've done to make today possible. So, welcome to everyone.
We are grateful for the whole team of folks that's helped make this happen today and for all who are part of it participating in any way. There may be no Hendrix alum who has more passionately and publicly lived out the college's statement of purpose, which includes engagement that links the classroom with the world and a commitment to diversity, inclusion, justice, and sustainable living, than Douglas A. Blackman, class of 1986, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and filmmaker. From his first book, Slavery by Another Name, to his Wall Street Journal coverage of the 9/11 terror attacks, to his coverage of the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, to his writing about the fall of the Berlin Wall, post-apartheid South Africa, and natural disasters such as Hurricane Katrina. His work has drawn numerous readers and viewers, and most importantly, provoked much needed conversations. With deep interest, his proud alma mater has invited him back for updates as Odyssey Medal recipient in 2009 and as commencement speaker in 2012. Once again, we welcome back to the Hendrix campus and to the online platform this friend and guide for the challenging work of dismantling the racism that so impedes our world, our communities, and the lives we cherish and love, and to help us ask the questions that can move us to truly embrace a new tomorrow. Following his prepared remarks, we will be taking questions for him both in person and online from attendees each place. Please join us now in welcoming warmly Douglas Blackman.
Well, it's really great to be back, and thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you, Ellis, for the good words. I really enjoyed my time yesterday with the students, talked to a history class, and talked over lunch with students interested in writing and about the writing life and such, and reminded the students that even though the world says that's all dying and going away, that in fact it's not, and that they write more than I ever wrote when I was their age. It's just they do it on small devices and much shorter increments of words. But the importance of all those things and the importance of what a liberal arts education brings to those students and equips them for, and we got to talk about some of those things, and then in the afternoon to some students a little more specifically and practically about how to pursue some of their interests in life, even though on that I have to confess that the world has changed so profoundly in terms of how one might imagine a career or trying to pursue a career that would take a young person to the kinds of work that I've done over the last 30 years. It's not that the path that I followed is gone, it's that there are now so many dozens of circuitous paths that go in every direction that might eventually lead to those same places. So I mostly just wished them good luck on that part of it. But it is great to be back in my alma mater. It's great to see friends again, both classmates and professors. David Larson is here. I'm particularly glad to see, and Jack Frost, and anybody else who's here that I was an admirer of long ago. Forgive me that I can't see you. If I didn't notice you coming in, I don't know you're here, but I still appreciate you. And I also got to spend some time with Rosemary Innenberg night before last, saw her again last night, and that was all of those kinds of folks. And we're all vulnerable to excessive nostalgia about these kinds of things, but it really is true how important you guys were to all of us, and for you students today, the people who are going to be that. When Werner Trishman and I were having dinner with Dr. Hindenburg, we started talking about that and doing some math, some very cruel math, and realizing that Werner and I are a decade older than she was when we first concluded that she was so wise and so knowledgeable about everything under the sun. And I'm still sort of trying to work that through. I have a different sense of myself as a low achiever now, having thought that through, because she's still a lot wiser than I am. But it's also a good thing. I always say this at the beginning of any talk like this, a thrill, really, in many respects, to spend time with people who care about the things that this event is about, whatever your exact perspective may be. And we might see some things differently, and hopefully we'll end up talking about that in some respects. But just the fact that you're here on a Saturday morning, on a lovely day, right off the bat, you've self-selected yourself into a group of American citizens who are interested in what I think are some of the most important challenges that face our society. And so it's always just a thrill to be among people who share some of that sentiment and care enough to want to talk about it and see where things should go. These days, it's also something of a sensation that I haven't ever had exactly this experience, but it feels a bit like I imagine it must feel when a drowning man hears the thump of a life buoy landing on the water next to him, because the troubled times and the troubled waters that I think we really are in right now evoke that sense of that if people who aren't interested in these issues and aren't looking for solutions and aren't trying to engage with one another and work through things that can be worked through to try to get to the harder parts, if we're not doing that, then we're all going to drown. We're all going to drown. So you're all life preservers to one another, and so I hope you'll think of yourselves that way and keep doing that. But so when Ellen asked me to speak today, the topic she assigned me, it was my first Hendricks assignment since 1986. The topic she assigned me was dismantling racism. And so I'm going to speak as best I can to that. That's a very big objective, but one that I, as I say, care much about. And so I'll talk about that. I'll offer some thoughts about some of the research and such that I've done over the years that relates to it, and some experiences that I've had from the very beginning of my life, almost, really the very beginning, all the way to the present. But I hope I won't talk for too long, and that then we will have a conversation and your reactions to some of those things. And I'm curious to hear your experiences and in particular the solutions that you may be able to see that I don't. Now I have to confess something, and that is that as I was thinking last night about what exactly I was going to say this morning, and when you talk a lot about these kinds of things, and actually, I haven't done that much now for most of the past 2 years. I used to be in this sort of setting for very, very frequently. But this is my first time to do anything like this since the pandemic began. But when you do that, you've talked about it a lot, whether you intend to or not, you end up saying the same things over and over again, just in different orders and sort of different combinations of the same things to people. And so it becomes kind of unusual to hear yourself say anything new in these conversations. It's also unusual for anybody to ask a question that you haven't heard before. To me, that's always the definition of the best kind of conversation like this, is when somebody actually asks me something that I've really never been asked before, and that provokes something that I haven't gone into. But so last night I was thinking about what I was going to be talking about today, and it was all stuff I was pretty familiar with. And then, like the primitive Baptist preacher who was one of my grandfathers, I realized that I had prepared the wrong remarks for today. And so I stayed up late last night and ended up doing the classic thing of pretty much abandoning everything that I was going to say this morning. So that's not necessarily a good thing. It does mean that you'll hear a different set of remarks for the most part than what I've said before. But part of it was that I was dwelling, as I thought about all that last night, on that no matter what I said, that it was going to be important to acknowledge at the beginning the day that this is, and what happened on this day 20 years ago, and important to acknowledge that the sad things that happened and the outrageous nature of what happened, and then the things that have happened since then. We mostly agree about what happened on this day 20 years ago. We begin to disagree about things that happened after that, all the way up until just the last few weeks. I mean, it really is quite remarkable it's rare that history is quite as neat as this 20 years have been in terms of the timing of the drama that has so affected American life. And so I was thinking I really ought to say something about that, particularly given that I tried to think of, maybe somebody correct me if you can think of an exception to this, but I think 9/11, is there any other date that is as notorious and where the date itself is the thing that defines it? We talk about D-Day and we talk about Pearl Harbor, but we don't really use the date. And when we do use the dates, it's like July 4th. It's a triumphant thing. But 9/11, yeah, is this most notorious set of numbers that we have. And so I thought, okay, I've got to bring that up in some fashion to be respectful of the memory and the anniversary, but also, as I was thinking about the topic and all that, is that I actually believe and have believed for a long time that 9/11 is actually inextricably entwined with the issue that we're actually here to talk about, of dismantling racism. And maybe not so much the how-to of dismantling racism, but the understanding the difficulties that we have around race and justice and equity in our society. I believe that 9/11 is actually a very, very substantial part of the story, and that if we don't understand the story of why things have gotten as tangled as they are, it's extremely difficult to figure out how to untangle them. So that's where my new set of remarks began. So I'm going to tell you a complicated story that relates to 9/11. So I will ask you to bear with me. You can only do this sort of thing with friends. So I'm going to count all of you as friends. You'll forgive me if my story is too complicated to make sense. But all of us, of a certain age at least, I realize that undergraduates today, I've talked to my own students over the past week or so. I asked, everyone, I said, you know what 9/11 is, right? And everybody generally nods their heads to that. But then I would say, well, but how much do you know? And I inquire out of genuine curiosity, how do you know what you do know about it? Have you because it's really not, even 20 years later, 9/11 is still not a part of our popular culture. There's been really one major motion picture that was the story of one part of 9/11. It was a film I still have never watched, and sort of couldn't bring myself to watch, and that was the story of Flight 93, the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. But so it's not really that so much history, to the alarm of historians like Dr. Larson, oftentimes. So much of our history that we learn, we acquire it from popular culture more than anywhere else. And that's why it's so dangerous in some ways and confusing when popular culture blurs things in ways that confuse us later about what really happened. But so we really don't have that in terms of the 9/11 story. So when I ask students, what do you know about it and how do you know what you do know, I'm always pleased to learn that it actually is something that's in the high school history textbook. It actually is taught in some fashion to most of the students. But my experience is that a lot of young people know that it has something to do with planes crashing into the World Trade Center, but maybe not a whole lot more. I think also that's partly because the events that have occurred since then have been so morally confusing for us that it makes talking about and understanding 9/11 complicated. Because if you think that the Iraq War was a terrible thing, or that the invasion of Iraq was a gigantic mistake or a diabolical thing, then it's difficult to square with that on 9/11, that we were justifiably enraged, for sure. That what happened on 9/11, why it happened, and maybe is another set of questions, but the outrage of 9/11 is sometimes hard to hold on to if you're outraged about things that happened in response to 9/11. So it's confusing more than anything else. And it's confusing, I think, for all of us to keep straight that actually what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan are somewhat different things. And it's all very complicated. And so in the confusion of the past 19 years, we've gotten more and more muddled, I think, about what really happened at the very beginning. Not the events, but what it meant to us. But all of us of a certain age have a 9/11 story to tell, just like the generation immediately before us all had a story of the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. And so when I was a kid, I was always hearing people tell their John F. Kennedy assassination story. And now, for those of us of a certain age, it's 9/11 in that sense. In my experience on 9/11, and I'm going to tell you a little bit of this story and a few other things, but I'm going to bring it back around to why we're really here. But my experience was a very dramatic one, not because I was in New York or directly experienced what happened. I was in Atlanta on that day. But I was a writer, and at that point an editor for the Wall Street Journal. And something that a lot of people don't know about, but that actually will be in a major motion picture coming out in about a year, and a book that's just come out about this. But on 9/11, when the second tower collapsed, it collapsed into the headquarters of the Wall Street Journal. And so my organization was sort of decapitated in the course of the events of that day. And for quite a few hours, we didn't really know, those of us out in offices around the country and around the world. And the Wall Street Journal still today has more people distributed around the globe and across the country than any other media organization that there is. That's also a surprise to people. And so, and my job, I was one of several dozen bureau chiefs around the globe, and we were the people who made the decisions every day about what was going to go into the next day's paper, and got on a phone call every day. So we were doing a kind of virtual remote work long before it became the commonplace it is for everybody today. And so we're watching as this unfolds on television. My responsibilities at that time as a business journalist and editor was that I was responsible for a group of reporters based in Atlanta, but also a number of reporters in other parts of the world who covered essentially all companies that moved objects or people. So all transportation companies, all freight companies, all passenger airlines, those were part of my responsibility in terms of the business coverage that I was responsible for. So when the first plane hit the first tower, I got a call from my duty reporter that morning right away. I had actually my wife and I had just taken our new daughter down to Central Presbyterian Church in downtown Atlanta to talk to the pastor there about her christening ceremony. And then it was, I think it was as we were leaving the church, my phone was blowing up, somebody trying to reach me, and I always knew that that meant something, so we scurried home and got everybody situated, and then I called back to see what this was about, and it was my reporter calling to say that something really weird has happened. A plane has crashed into the World Trade Center, and it's not clear what exactly is going on. And I said, well, and there was a plane that once crashed into the Empire State Building by accident decades ago. And so my first reaction was, maybe that could be an accident, but it seems really unlikely. And are we sure that it's even a plane? Because there wasn't yet footage, there wasn't images yet to tell us that for sure that it was. It turned out that the online journalism was a new thing at that stage too, but the Wall Street Journal had a earlier and more advanced digital newspaper than most organizations, and so our digital office, which was across the street from our headquarters, had not been wiped out. And so our online staff, the small online staff in New York, had begun reporting, and I think probably put out the first headline that said an explosion had occurred at the World Trade Center. But my first word was that, the odds of this being an accident seem very unlikely. And then I hurried down to the office, and by the time I got into the office, the first tower was, the fire was raging, and then the second plane hit. And then it was like, okay, obviously this is not, and there clearly was a plane, and this is not some crazy coincidence of two planes at once. And so, all right, this is something very, very serious. Still was incomprehensible what was going to happen next. But then as we're watching and making phone calls and trying to figure out what people should be doing, and this was early enough, the first plane hit at 8:45 in the morning. And that was early enough that, particularly in those days when the printed newspaper was what really mattered, and so your focus was on the paper coming out the next day, and you didn't really report things in the middle of the day before. You hid them from your competitors until as late as possible. And that was still the way the world worked in those days. And so most reporters came into the office, not at 8 in the morning, but at 10 o'clock in the morning, because you're going to work until 7 or 8 or 9 or o'clock or midnight or 1 o'clock, depending on what the stories were. And so fortunately for us, most of the staff of the Wall Street Journal in New York were still making their way into the office, coming in from New Jersey and the suburbs and elsewhere in Manhattan and Brooklyn. But everybody, including me, during the times over the years that I would work out of the New York offices, almost all of us passed through the World Trade Center. The main train station that all of us would go to was in the basement of the World Trade Center, and then we'd cross Liberty Street over to our building across the street. And so, fortunately, the only people who were in the building as this was unfolding were those pesky people who show up earlier than they should and make the rest of us look bad, and a few other people who really had to be there. So, fortunately, that turned out to be the case, and in the end, none of our people were killed that day. There were some people who were hurt and people who suffered in other ways greatly, but no one was killed. But at the time this is all unfolding, it also meant that not very many people were on duty. And so we're all trying to figure out what's happening and who's there and who's going to do what, and if this is a terrorist attack, who's going to take responsibility for this? And I'm on the phone with my counterpart in Washington, and that's the biggest other bureau outside of New York, and we're trying to divvy things up even before the top managers of the paper, would appear. And then as all of that is happening and we're watching things unfold on television, we see the first tower collapse. And I turned to my reporters who were standing there with me, and I kind of shook my head and said, what did we just see? And really it was like a sort of some optical illusion. Because it's not there anymore. The tower's not there anymore, and is that possible? Almost. And I really didn't quite believe it, even as I was still watching it. And then not much later, then the other tower goes down, and it's like, this is this is what it appears to be. And when it went down, that's when it went into our headquarters. and just wiped out everything. Just wiped out and so our computers went dead, and everything that was centralized just cut off instantly. And we didn't know, even still, we sort of assumed at that point that there had to have been our people somewhere in the midst of all this, and so there's both a personal question of your particular friends, what has happened to those people, but there's also a lot of work to be done, and everything's dead, and so then I and the other bureau chiefs outside of New York began to talk with each other and say, well, we have to assume the worst. We have to assume that nothing's going to come back online, and that critical people are gone, and so we have to figure out a way to put out the paper. How do we publish an edition of the Wall Street Journal with our headquarters having just been wiped out? And so we began talking to each other, and then this kind of very dramatic, miraculous kind of story begins to unfold over the course of the day, and that's what this movie that's coming next year, I think, focuses on. But ultimately, we did get the paper out, and people in New York did survive, and it turned out that a few of them remembered. It's very, very cinematic, actually, that a couple of people remembered that, oh, wait a minute, at the printing plant out in New Jersey, or actually in Princeton, had a Princeton address, because Dow Jones, the company, liked having a Princeton address, even though it really wasn't in Princeton. But we had a big printing plant in Princeton that printed all the papers for New York, for Metro New York. And some folks remembered that there was a little emergency newsroom that was built at the printing plant that had computers and some sort of it was sort of I think had been built in anticipation of if there was a blackout or something, a power outage, that you could still have the key operations possible from there. And so a handful of people remembered that and started going in reverse, back out to New Jersey and back out to that, and then other people began to hear about that was the place to go. And then there was this sort of miraculous moment. I'm telling the story for a little too long, but there was this really dramatic moment where, as I say, all the systems were down, and email worked a little differently in those days than it does now, and so we were in constantly what we would call emailing today, but it was an internal system. It was a sort of just within the Wall Street Journal system of sending messages to one another, and that had all gone dead. And then all of a sudden, like out of a movie, computer screens kind of start flashing up again, and you see some things, and then an all-staff message pops up, and you think, oh, this will be the managing editor, sending out a reassurance that we're back online and we're gonna figure out what to do and everybody's okay. But instead, it was a message from, I always got to choke up on this, so forgive me, but it was a message from a reporter, just a colleague, who said, this is so-and-so, and I'm back. I've made it back to my apartment in Brooklyn, and I've got, Jamie and Susan are with me, and we're ready to work. What do we do? Somebody tell us what to do. We're ready to go. And they didn't know who to send that to, because nobody knew what was happening, and so they just sent it to all staff. So it went out to all of the thousands of people who were on that email list. And so then the even more remarkable thing was that then somebody else, also just a peer, responded to that and said, yeah, well, this is Jim, and I'm in Lower Manhattan, and we made it to this place, outside the blast zone, and we're ready too, and just tell us where to go, and then these messages started piling up on one another. And I described it to people later as that, and this really was the image that came into my mind at the time. It was like a big ship, a big giant ship on the ocean, suddenly engulfed in a storm, and giant waves crashing over the bow of the ship, and the storm getting more and more intense, and then suddenly the ship just disappearing under the surface of the ocean, and that was how it felt when the second tower went down and everything died. And then all of a sudden, there was this smokestack, that just kind of poked up from the surface of the ocean, and then another smokestack, and then it took a while. And then finally this giant ship starts lumbering back up out of the water, and And it was a day before we really knew for sure about some key people who really were kind of lost for a day. But we put a paper out. Put a paper out the next day, and that was the thing that was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for the coverage of 9/11. So that was sort of my essential 9/11 story. But the other part of that is more personal is that it wasn't very long after that well, first I'll say my job became immediately after 9/11. My job changed dramatically. And I was one of 3 editors who were assigned the task of assembling a team of reporters. Each of us had to put together a different team of reporters to essentially figure out we knew the names of the hijackers immediately. Within 18 hours, the names of all the hijackers had been established by the FBI and the CIA, and we had those names right off the bat. But the job was to say, who are these people? And, why would they do this? And are they Al-Qaeda? And assuming that they are Al-Qaeda, but still, who would do such a thing, And that was at a time when we still didn't really, most people had not ever heard of Osama bin Laden at that point, even though we should have, and some of us had. But so my job became to take about a third of the hijackers themselves and assemble this team of reporters, and for us to then figure out who they were and every step they had made, and essentially to investigate the hijackers. And so we did that. And part of the remarkable power of the Wall Street Journal in those days was that the leader of that group who died was an Egyptian man named Mohammed Atta, and Atta's parents lived in a suburb of one of the big cities in Egypt. And we had a reporter at the parents' front door the next morning on September the 12th. We actually had somebody at the home and interviewed the father, Mohammed Atta, less than 24 hours, as I recall, after the towers had gone down. But so we spent weeks and really months, but we assembled a kind of vast understanding of who all those folks were. We also avoided, these are things that are even more so forgotten now, but we avoided some of partly about just luck, because I actually nearly made one of the worst mistakes we could possibly have made in the course of all this. But we ultimately avoided the thing that a lot of other news organizations did not, and it was partly because we were better than them, but it was also partly good fortune. But there were these stories that were going around at the time that there had been sleeper cells in the U.S. That was the term, that there were these Arab sleeper cells, and these Al-Qaeda sleeper cells, but people who had come to the United States and embedded in society and had families and children, and that it might be that your next door neighbor, if they look different, might somehow be part of this kind of a conspiracy. And there were stories on the front page of the New York Times that said that happened, and that named addresses and people in Florida, in Vero Beach, Florida, that this was a sleeper cell at this house, and where you had local officials and police officers confirming those things, all of which turned out to be incorrect, all of which turned out to be wrong. There were diabolical things happening, but not that, not that. And somehow we avoided a good bit of that out of care, out of what really was a higher degree of care. But then, as all that was happening, one of our reporters who was out there trying to figure out who these people were, and actually probably the most compassionate reporter ever to work for the Wall Street Journal, maybe one of the most compassionate ever in American media, was trying to understand the shoe bomber, and only people my age will have any recollection of that. But there was another attempt to blow up a jetliner not all that long after 9/11, and that was by the person who attempted to do that was named Richard Reed, and he had a bomb, an explosive in his shoes, and because Al-Qaeda was trying to come up with all these ways to get an explosive on a plane. And most of them were, is there a way that one person could carry this chemical and another person could carry that one, or, and then once you're on the plane, put them together and then make a bomb, And so Richard Reed was an example of that, and was basically a poor soul in a way, poor misguided fool, had been sucked into something. But he tries to blow up this plane, mostly just burns himself up, and at that point, no passengers on an airline were going to ever see their plane taken into a building ever again, and which is why the fourth plane had gone down on 9/11, and the passengers had stopped that guy too. And so we had this reporter who was trying to understand him, this guy, Richard Reed, and got a lead. It was a reporter in South Asia, and got a lead on a better understanding of where this guy had been, where he had become radicalized, time that he had spent in Pakistan, and so he headed to Pakistan to run this down, and a very brave reporter, and his name was Danny Pearl, who had worked in the Atlanta office, and we weren't best brothers, but we'd been good friends at a point in our career, and of course he's kidnapped by, he'd been set up and sucked into this situation by a different group of bad people, not Al-Qaeda, but then they sold him to Al-Qaeda. They sold him to turn him over to Al-Qaeda, and specifically to a man named Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, KSM, his initials go. And Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the person who had planned the 9/11 attacks. He was the organizer of the 9/11 attacks, and then he came into possession of Danny Pearl, and then killed him. Decapitated him on camera and broadcast it over the internet. And it's him. It's the arm of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed you see in the image, killing Danny Pearl. And that person, by the way, just as an aside, I won't go down this road, but Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was then captured by U.S. and other forces in 2003. So less than 2 years after 9/11, he was captured, taken to Guantanamo Bay, and again, that's another. All the things that happened in Guantanamo Bay are another very complicated story, but he's been there now, for 18 years. And so, we have had in custody for 18 years the main person responsible for what happened on 9/11, who admits to it and admits to the murder of Danny Pearl. And because of our dysfunctional politics, our dysfunctional society, the way that we have arrived at a set of, it's much worse now than it was at the beginning of this, but that the signs were already there 20 years ago, that of a coming political environment and social environment in which the choice would be made that rather than my political opponents end up having the credit of trying and convicting and maybe executing the most terrible person most responsible for 9/11, rather than having something like that happen and get credit for that, that they then might use to advance themselves politically, I'll obstruct that happening. We'll create barriers to justice being fulfilled in the case of something like that for purely crass political calculations. And for me, that one example, that's the most powerful single anecdote to me of just how screwed up all of this has become, just how screwed up our motives have become. And that does relate very much so back to the topic of our difficulty with dealing with racism. But back to 9/11 for a minute. I told you it was a long and complicated story, so I force my students to tell stories in classes that I teach in chronological order. But I'm not my student, and so I'm going to make you go through a more circuitous version of things. But so I told you what happened on 9/11 on the actual day, but my 9/11 story, and in some respects the part that's most relevant personally to what we really want to talk about today, began about a week before 9/11, and that was when I got on a plane to South Africa. And the reason I was going to South Africa on September the 1st or August the 31st of 2001 was that there was a conference about to happen in Durban, South Africa, that was a United Nations sponsored global conference on racism, the UN Conference on Racism, which in 2001 had been a kind of a big story. I mean, it's sort of a wonky thing, but had gotten a lot of attention over the summer before that, because the Bush administration, for reasons mostly associated with the Palestinian conflict in Israel, all these complicated things that come in. But the Bush administration had ordered Secretary of State Colin Powell not to attend this conference. and that there would be no American delegation to this conference for a whole bunch of reasons that really had more to do with Israel and Palestine than anything else. But so the U.S. wasn't going to participate in this UN conference on racism, which was something that didn't happen on a regular basis. There's a distinctive event. But so that had been the controversy. But the reason I was going was because there were a small army of other Americans who did go, including every African-American member of Congress. So the entire Congressional Black Caucus went. A lot of very prominent civil rights leaders in America went. And I was sort of in the midst of a series of stories that I wrote over a long period of time that dealt with the legacy of racism in American society, and in particular, looking at corporate conduct and the role of commerce in the history of segregation and the history of racial separation and racial injuries in America. Now, at the time, and even today, people often would say, well, why would the Wall Street Journal have been interested in a story like that? And anybody who asked me that, it always sort of is an indicator to me they probably weren't readers of the Wall Street Journal, because actually we were very interested in that, because there was an understanding that actually that's part of reporting on the success of an economy, the success of a society, the success of businesses and organizations has something to do with how well they manage these complicated things like race in our society. And so it wasn't unnatural for there to be an interest in that. And I had always been interested in these things. And I had, just a couple weeks earlier, I had published a story. I was told at the time it was the longest story that had ever appeared in the Wall Street Journal. Kind of proud of that. As Dr. Larson might remember, I always have had a proclivity for too many words and too long remarks. But so it published a story that was about what? What can you imagine? It was about this surprising thing of evidence that slavery had persisted beyond the Civil War in the United States, and that companies had exploited this loophole and this perversion of the criminal justice system, which had been used to provide African-American men primarily as forced laborers to commercial interests well into the 20th century. So that was the story that then became the book, Slavery by Another Name, and then became the film. And so I had just published that original story that sort of started that thing, and I had no idea of the degree to which that, the tiger whose tail I had latched onto, and that was essentially going to take over my life very soon, all the way up to this day. But so that had happened a couple weeks earlier, and now I was headed off to South Africa to finish a story I'd been working on about the slavery reparations movement that had been percolating up in the United States in the late 1990s. And people don't remember today that happened, but there had been this pretty active discussion about slavery reparations that sounded a lot like the one that's going on today, where in recent years that's become a topic again that people are talking about. But it was still back then in 2001. There were certain people talking about it, but it was not a really widely talked about thing, even in the way that it is today. But I was very curious about it, and had been talking to a lot of different people about it. And of course, that was something that slavery reparations, contrary to what a lot of people assume, particularly a lot of white people in America assume, but that notion of slavery reparations was something that really nobody had viewed as whether white, black, or otherwise, it was not something that was widely supported or considered plausible. There were very, very few people who embraced or promoted that idea for mostly practical reasons. And so it had been a fringe idea. Now, it was an idea that had been discussed since 1866. It had always been out there that should there be something like that. But it had always lived on the fringes of discussion about race in America. But then in the late 90s, it had begun to percolate up as something that certainly some people, but some very established African-American leaders were beginning to say, maybe we should be talking about this. Maybe this is something that matters. But in that long period of time in which it had been out on the fringes of any sort of discussion, I used to joke that until a certain point in time, I would joke mostly with African-American friends of mine about this or people who were interested in this, but I'd say, yeah, until whenever, nobody had ever even said the word slavery reparations who wasn't wearing a dashiki, an African cap, the sort of the sign of African-American with, with left political thinking. All of those are cliches and stereotypes. But it was this idea way out there. And in fact, no major American civil rights figure had ever supported it in a significant way, except maybe in some respects Louis Farrakhan. But that's sort of on the edges of those discussions anyway. But Dr. King never said anything that would have suggested a support for direct financial compensation as reparations for his legacy. He never said anything about taking down Confederate monuments. He never said. In fact, I had a conversation with Andrew Young a few years ago when the Confederate flag debate was first percolating up, and I asked Andy, who he and I used to have offices. I was in an office one floor immediately above his office, and so every now and then I'd go down to his office and talk to him about these things. And I said, Ambassador Young and for those who don't know, Andy Young was one of the 3 or 4 lieutenants closest to Dr. King during the civil rights era. And I said, well, what about this Confederate flag thing? What did Dr. King ever say about this? Or, what did he think about it? And he said, oh, Doug, I don't remember him ever saying anything about the Confederate flag. And, there were so many other things that, we had to focus on. That was, I don't remember that ever being something that we talked about, that he had a view on. And I think he would have thought that would be a sort of a silly thing for us to even try to talk about then, in the midst of what was happening in the 1960s. And so reparations, was even further out on the fringe than something like that, and had never been embraced by the kind of core identifiable leadership around these issues. And even Jesse Jackson, who was the youngest of the lieutenants around Dr. King, who were there when he was assassinated in 1968. And of course, Reverend Jackson goes on to be perceived as the most radical and the most militant, as some people like to use, in the succeeding years of those who'd been involved in the movement, the leadership of the movement. But even Reverend Jackson, never really much in public because it never came up much, but behind the scenes, in the background, he had always said, no, this reparations thing is crazy talk. It'll never go anywhere, and it'll just distract us, and it'll get in the way of other things. So even Jesse Jackson had said, no, never. That is not what the movement is about. And so that had been the way things worked for a very long time. And now it's 2001, and there's this conference about to happen in South Africa. But I've been picking up on this discussion that's growing around this kind of radical idea. And so I said, okay, well, I got to figure out how to tell this story, so who are the characters in this story? And so I ended up latching onto this one person, probably other than faculty here at Hendrix, maybe the most brilliant person I've ever known, but Dr. Charles Ogletree, who's the mentor to Barack and Michelle Obama when they were at Harvard Law School, and but just towering intellect of American jurisprudence, who sadly now suffers from dementia and is alive, but we've lost to dementia this extraordinary mind. But he was trying to develop a strategy for how to raise this issue through the courts. Was there a way to compel reparations of some sort through the courts? And part of what he was relying on, I told you the story was going to be circuitous. I'm taking another little loop. But part of what he was relying on was that in the mid-1990s, a few years earlier, there'd been these lawsuits brought by Holocaust survivors in Germany and Switzerland against the companies, the surviving companies and successor companies to ones that had used forced Jewish laborers during World War II. Or in the case of banks in Switzerland, had stolen the fortunes of Jewish families that then died had deposited their resources in these banks, then died in the Holocaust, and then the banks had ultimately stolen their fortunes rather than find the heirs to those things. And so there were these lawsuits popping up in the mid-1990s. And what was most those things got a good bit of coverage at the time because that's a moral issue that we like, because it's clear who the bad guys and the good guys are. It's clear that, and there may be some technical details that are complicated, but we like stories that have a clear villain, and Nazis are the best clear villain you can come up with, and the only rival is the Klan, and so we love clear villains and clear victims. And so Americans thought, yeah, well, that makes sense, these lawsuits being filed against these German corporations, even though they were doomed. There was no possibility that those lawsuits would succeed for a couple of reasons. But under German law, as it existed at that time, one, they were just 100% foreclosed. There was no possibility of pursuing those cases under German law, primarily because Germany had paid reparations at the end of World War II, at the time it signed the peace treaty. It had paid reparations to the new state of Israel, and had paid what sounded like large amounts of money at the time that had been paid to Israel. And so there were reparations that had already been paid in the 1950s, and then the peace treaty that was signed specifically said, you're going to pay these reparations, and all further claims are foreclosed. You can't ask for anything, nobody gets to ask for anything else. I mean, that's the point of a peace treaty, is that, okay, the war's over, these folks get that land, you have to pay these people, we're going to take those oil reserves, but you divvy it all up, but it's over now, and everybody has to live with that. And so these lawsuits that were being filed were up against a kind of just impossible legal standard, legal barriers. But nonetheless, the moral suasion of the argument was so profound, so undeniable, that they had a force that was beyond the law, and all around the world. And for sure in the United States, people saw those cases happening and said, yeah, of course, yes. And it doesn't matter that the company that exists today, that its only connection to this place where there were slave laborers and where people died, it doesn't matter that it was actually a different company, and the company that exists today bought that facility or that remnant of a facility, but still they connect. They connect back to this terrible thing. And so when they bought that building, when they bought that land, they bought that moral obligation. That was the argument. And we, Americans for sure, who were paying attention to it, nobody said, oh, that's really unfair. That's really unfair. And all the people who did the bad things are all dead, or for the most part are all dead. And that, it's really not fair to go to the modern company and ask them to compensate people who were injured by these other people. But we were untroubled, for the most part, by those kinds of complexities. And the Clinton administration, this was during the presidency of Bill Clinton, the Clinton administration was very supportive of these lawsuits and thought they were absolutely just. And of course, they were absolutely just in some way or another. And so the Clinton administration proposed a new law in Congress that created a new channel under American law where some of those lawsuits could be moved from Germany and into the American courts and be pursued through our court system, which is friendlier to those kinds of claims, to injury claims. And that's why all the billboards in America advertise lawyers who are pursuing injury cases. And so the Clinton administration was very comfortable with this. Everybody was really, the smartest people in America were comfortable with this. The smartest lawyers in America were comfortable with all that. And there was this sensibility that, yes, what happened was so terrible in the Holocaust that examining these corporations through a lens that is completely unflinching and completely unforgiving and has no filters on it whatsoever is completely appropriate because of the gravity of what had happened. And that's an unassailable position, really. And so I had taken interest in that. I spent a lot of time in Germany and Austria in the first 10 years after I graduated from Hendrix. In the beginning, that was mostly because I had fallen hook, line, and sinker for an exchange student from Austria. But when it turned out that she ultimately had not fallen quite as hook, line, and sinker for me as I had for her, that was no longer the reason that I was going to Austria. But I ended up doing a lot of reporting from that part of the country, that part of the world, and that's why I ended up being in Berlin in November of 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down, which I was not yet a skillful enough journalist to really do justice to what I witnessed, but I certainly, that was something to witness, and to watch the world be completely redefined in so many ways, that was really something to witness. But so I'd been spending time in Germany in the late 80s and the early 90s, and one of the things that I'd picked up on in the course of all that was how differently Germany, both Germanys, because I spent some time in East Germany before reunification, and then back in that part of Germany afterwards. And one of the things that I had already picked up on in some of that was how differently Germans, and by no means perfectly, I mean, the Germans had their own complicated story in terms of how to grapple with the past and how to deal with the legacy of this horrible, horrible collective sin that they had committed. But nonetheless, even with their complicated approach to it, they had done things very differently than the way that Americans had processed our fantastic, large, cardinal sin of the enslavement of tens of millions of people. We forget actually the numbers because there were 4 million enslaved people in 1860, but there were tens of millions of people who, over the course of the previous 250 years and beyond, had suffered the indignities of American racial intolerance and abuse and degradation and the things that came after slavery. And so our approach to all that until the 1960s, had been mostly a kind of denial. I mean, we fought a war, very creditable war, in which lots of Americans lost their lives in a sense, to bring an end to slavery. But then we didn't know what to do. We lost our way, and ultimately, very, very fast forwarding the story, we gave back the moral victory of the Civil War in many respects. White people in the North who had been friendly to the idea of the liberation of African Americans by the beginning of the 20th century weren't anymore. And there was still a broad view that it was the right thing to have ended slavery, but there was the most commonly held view among white Americans, and probably among virtually all white Americans, was that giving the vote to African Americans had been a mistake. That liberation had been correct, but citizenship had probably been wrong. And that was really the consensus of mainstream American life 100 years ago, 125 years ago. And it was in that same period of time that Confederate monuments began to proliferate everywhere. And this tremendous need to justify the conflict of the Civil War and to justify, in some sense, the ongoing subjugation of African Americans, the descendants of the enslaved before. Well, then you go over to Germany. Well, when there's a war, people die, and in a place like Germany, though it had been no matter how wrong Germany was about the things that had led to the events of World War II, there also were millions of people who died, soldiers and also civilians, and so this massive, massive grief on the part of human beings, this massive loss. And so people need ways to grieve even when they are the bad people in the picture, even when they're the ones who started the fight or did the worst things. They still grieve. They're still human beings, whether they fully understood why these things had happened or not. But Germany did, partly because it was under the boot of the Allies, of us. We were insisting that well, you don't get to, you can bury your dead, and you can pray over them, and you can feel sad about your dead, and we're even going to help you rebuild your country. But you can't put up a sign somewhere that says, in memory of Johann, or Wolfgang, in memory of Wolfgang, who fought for the noblest cause ever in the history of man. You can't put that sign up. You can't pretend that there was something okay about what you did. Well, we took the opposite approach. I mean, it was an earlier time, but we took the opposite approach in our society. We essentially did the equivalent, and I'm the descendant of Confederate soldiers, and probably more of them than I am even aware of, all inconsequential privates, and one or two of whom may well have deserted, as far as I can tell. But I could join the Sons of Confederate Veterans as long as they didn't look closely at who I was. But I qualify, and so this isn't some outsider looking in on it. But what all Americans ended up doing was that rather than really tangling with what all that meant and the sort of failure to fully restructure society in a just way at the end of the Civil War. It's really no surprise that didn't go very smoothly. It's no surprise that our attempt to totally change the structure of Iraq and Afghanistan, didn't go very well either, because it's not easy to do those things. It's not easy to, in the blink of an eye, to make a society think differently and its instincts to behave differently. Those are hard things to do, and nobody had ever done anything like what happened in America in the 1860s. I don't think ever in human history there's another example of a people who looked the same and speak the same language and lived in the same place going to war against each other at fantastic loss and fantastic cost over, ultimately, a kind of theoretical principle in a way, over this idea that, hey, this is supposed to be the land of the free in which everybody's created equal, and it's not, obviously, and we end up in a war over this thing. I mean, so actually the American Civil War is really quite a distinctive event in human history. And so, being so distinctive, it's no surprise that everything got screwed up afterwards. People really didn't know how to go from there. Well, so we end up essentially saying, okay, we end up saying the equivalent of if the Allies had said to Germany in 1945, 1946, if we had said to the Germans, okay, we're leaving now, and you can, if you want to find the surviving Nazi leaders and make them the new Führer, and if you want the Nazi Party to still, and there were Nazis at the very end, Nazis in the bunker with Hitler who were planning this, working on this thing. If you want them to run your country, then you can do whatever you want. If you want to fly the swastika, you want to fly Nazi flags, you can. Fly the flag, put up monuments that say we were right. And the only reason we lost was because the other guys cheated. You do whatever, say whatever you want to say. Just don't start murdering Jews again. Essentially, that what we did in America was the equivalent of that. Where essentially said, by the beginning of the 20th century, okay, you can say that it wasn't about slavery. You can, in the South, you can say that this was actually about tariffs and states' rights, and you can make up whatever story you want, and you can stop black people from voting. You can violate the constitutional rights that have been given to them. You can celebrate that. You can put up statues and things designed to intimidate them and remind them that no, you don't get to be citizens no matter what somebody told you or your dad. No, you don't get to do those things. You can do all that. You just can't recreate something that looks exactly like slavery again. You can't, and you certainly can't call it slavery. As long as you don't do that, you can do whatever else you want. And that's the period of time when the New York Times is running editorials that says, with the title on it, "The Negro Problem," and the New York Times is editorializing that says, hey, we need to let the white men of the South sort this out. They know what to do. Let's let the white men of the South just figure out the Negro question, as it was called. And so it really was, in many respects, the equivalent of if we had said to the Germans, sure, you can be Nazis, you just can't do this one thing that now defines this whole experience. And so if you go to a cemetery in Germany, their monuments vary, memorials vary, but the typical German memorial in a cemetery in Germany or Austria is one big giant slab of granite, but a big, huge granite, not a tall thing, but something that might be 5 or 6 feet high and 3 or 4 feet wide, and it will say on one side, on the side that faces the public, in a sense, it almost always just says 2 words, "Unsere Helden," just says "our heroes." And you can object to that. You can quibble even with that, but it just says "Unsere Helden," our heroes. And then on the back, it just has the names of everybody from that town who died in World War II, all the soldiers for sure. And in some cases, it also has the soldiers from World War I, if the town's World War I monument was destroyed in the war. The World War I monuments that survived look a lot like our monuments. They're celebratory and they're self-defensive. They proclaim, just like Confederate monuments did, that, oh, Germany was actually not wrong in the First World War. So we have that similarity as well. But so I'm spending time in Germany in that period of time. The country, we go through the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of the 2 Germanys. There's a big flare-up of anti-Semitism, particularly in East Germany, which is, I will stop myself from going into the details of all that, but in this other environment where there actually are a set of somewhat similar issues to the ones that confront America, there are things that I begin to be able to see more clearly, and I begin to be less distracted by that my ancestors were Confederate veterans and things like that. And I began to see the astonishing kind of hypocrisy to the way that we had done things in the United States. So here I am now. So that's what I've been doing. I've started writing these stories in the Wall Street Journal that say, okay, let's look at American commerce, American companies, which is something that really was not a focus of the Civil Rights Movement. Civil Rights Movement was really about the state. It was about compelling the state to stop requiring injuries to African Americans. That's what the Civil Rights Movement was about. It was about, like, the state has to stop saying black people don't get to vote, black people don't get to go to the same schools as white kids, and those are state functions, state actions. And that's what the Civil Rights Movement was really about. It really didn't get into the reality that commerce, just as is still the case today, commerce is what enforces the great majority of those kinds of laws and expectations in our society. When you file your taxes, those of you who are at that point yet in your life, but when you file your taxes, it's not the IRS that makes you follow the tax rules. I mean, they're in your mind somewhere, but it's your accountant that, it's this person that you're paying money to, who's a professional. That's the person who says, well, no, you can't do that. This is how we have to do it this way. That's the rule. That's the law. It's the real estate agent who decided in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and maybe still today, it's a real estate agent who would say, well, no, I'm not going to show you that house in that neighborhood because you're black. And black people shouldn't live in that neighborhood. It wasn't the government who was coming out and saying, you can't buy that house. It was actually a real estate agent who was saying that. It was a banker who was saying, no, we're not going to give you that loan on that house, but we will loan you money to buy this other house in this other neighborhood, which is where you're supposed to be living anyway. And so it was commerce that was enforcing on the scale of millions and millions and millions of people the mechanics of how racial oppression worked in our society. We like to focus on the clearer villains, because that banker is one of us is granddaddy or daddy, so we really don't want to focus on that part. And that banker, was an elder in the church that we grew up in, and was a good person and was kind to black people in some other way that we saw. And we have a version of our grandfather or whoever that person is that is of this person who maybe was a man of his time. That's a phrase I heard all the time as a kid, but who fundamentally was good. And it would be really uncomfortable to kind of even talk about any of that stuff and the effects of those things. And so instead, we much prefer Bull Connor. We much prefer these outrageous, villainous figures who set the dogs on civil rights protesters. And we love the Klan, like we love Nazis, because they're fun to hate. And it's really simple, because once they go away, well, then, okay, it's all, it's taken care of. The bad guy's dead, and it's a nice, neat conclusion to things. And so in the 90s, I'm making these observations, and I start writing these stories about commerce, where essentially I say, well, let's look at American corporations the same way that we are so supportive of examining German corporations and the things that they were a part of. And so a series of stories grew out of that, including the one that led ultimately to the book that I wrote and taking over my life. But now we're back to 1st of September 2001. And so I'm getting on this plane, fly to South Africa. All these African-American civil rights leaders are there. They actually gather in this kind of, secret's the wrong word, but this unannounced meeting that they all know about, nobody else knows about, but I happen to be there. I think I literally was the only white person in it was the city council chambers of the city of Durban, South Africa, this colonial structure that the British had built, long before, or that the British had built, I should say. And so the Congressional Black Caucus, the entire Congressional Black Caucus is meeting there. This lawyer from Harvard Law is leading the discussions. A whole pantheon of American civil rights figures are there. Not Andy Young, we'll say, but many others. And there's word, I happen to know, the crowd doesn't know, but that almost certainly Jesse Jackson is going to appear. It hasn't been announced, but this is 20 years ago, and Jesse Jackson's a very vigorous figure in American life. He'd run for president in 1988, and people forget what a significant thing that was. Jesse Jackson won five Democratic primaries in 1988, and then because of that was able to force the Democratic Party to make changes in the way that delegates are handed out that became the reason why Barack Obama was able to win the Democratic nomination in 2008. And there's a little detail of history, but a very important one. So Jesse Jackson is actually a very consequential figure in American life in ways that are not always as obvious. But so this conversation is going on. In the beginning, it's mostly kind of standard speeches and such that are happening. Lots of denouncing of the Bush administration for not sending a delegation, an official delegation, all that. But then all of a sudden, word goes out that Jesse Jackson's in the building, and Jesse Jackson is going to come to the stage in a minute. And then literally, this sounds impossible, but just as he's about to get on the stage, a phone call comes in to one of his assistants, and they grab him and say, "Hold on, Reverend Jackson, you can't go out quite yet. You got to take this call." And it's Yasser Arafat on the phone, who some of you will recognize, but the leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, and at that time viewed by most people as the Osama bin Laden of his time, but the leader of Palestine. I'm almost positive that it's Yasser Arafat who's on the phone, and who's dead within not too long after that. And they negotiate the release of an Israeli soldier who had been, taken by the PLO somewhere, in some conflict. And then they negotiate this thing over the phone, and the Israeli soldier is released that day. And then Jesse Jackson walks out on the stage in front of this group. And I don't think there's any record of this. And I never wrote an account of this because of 9/11. I don't think this is in any book or in any article anywhere. But he comes out on the stage and he starts talking, and it kind of winds it up, and sort of goes through the regular motions of building the crowd and getting everybody listening. And then he says, and one thing I want to talk about is reparations. I want to talk about slavery reparations. I know that a lot of you have been talking about it. You've been hearing a lot about it. And he said, I wish I had a recording of it, but I remember it pretty clearly. He said, and I know that you all know that I have always been against this. I have always said this is folly, that to pursue reparations is folly. It'll never happen. It will turn our allies against us. It's impractical. I can't think of how it would even work. There are all of these reasons that even if it makes sense in a way, it's impossible. And so I have always said we can't do this. It will consume us and distract us. It's the wrong thing. I've always been completely opposed to this idea. I'm here today to tell you I no longer believe that. I believe that it is time that this become the object of the American Civil Rights Movement. And as we pursue this, there are other things that will have to fall away. That I remember very precisely. Other things must fall away. And of course, what he was reflecting, and what that whole discussion was reflecting, and what today reflects a version of, was that a deal had been made in America. A social compact had been arrived at without anybody ever signing a document. But we had made, as a nation, as a society, after the death of Dr. King, and after which sort of broke the dam, broke the last big walls of obvious resistance. It broke the people who were still, ridiculously and obscenely trying to explain why segregation maybe was actually okay, and still sticking to crazy talk of that science says black people and white people are different. There were still people all the way up to the late 1960s who were holding on to those ideas that are just insane by our current understanding of anything, and no one sane would ascribe to today. But the death of Dr. King had finally obliterated those arguments. And even if you agreed with them, people stopped saying them. And then there was this compact. There was a deal was agreed to, mostly in silence. but a deal was agreed to that, okay, now we have to kind of balance the books somehow, and so, yeah, black kids and white kids have to go to the same schools, and people have to get the same resources to the schools that they go to, and everybody has to get to go to a good public school. We have to do something about poverty, and even if we don't call it reparations, even if we don't call it that, oh, this is money that's only for poor black people, so we can't really do things that way, so we have to give all poor people, some sort of support and help. We have to address a bunch of things that are legacies of these terrible things that we've done and that we've ignored and pretended about. We have to have something that we're going to call affirmative action. The federal government comes up with affirmative action, and that's one thing, of all the things I ever bring up with people, that's the one that people are more likely to say they agree with me on everything else, but disagree with me about affirmative action. But affirmative action is this thing, and does everybody know what affirmative action is? Okay. Is this idea that, that sometimes it's called set-asides, but that, okay, if Hendrix is gonna admit, how many freshmen do you admit every year? 350, okay, or whatever the number is, okay, 1/3 of them, we're gonna save 1/3 of the slots for African-American kids, or Asian kids, or Latin kids. So that's a set-aside, a specific set-aside. And then we never really had very many of those things, but affirmative action became this thing where we said, okay, we're not gonna set aside a specific number, but we are gonna say that it's good for our student body to represent a whole lot of different kinds. It's good for the white kids, for there to be some black kids. It's good for the black kids, for there to be some Latin kids. And it's good for everybody, for there to be some diversity, for there to be some geographic diversity. And it's good for society if by appreciating that, we end up with more African-American kids going to this good school, that there's value to that. And so multiply that out again across thousands of things in our society, opportunities. And in a world in which there had been tremendous amount of affirmative action before, it had all been exclusively for white kids. Everything was set aside specifically for white kids up until that point, all of these kinds of things. And so we start doing that stuff without ever signing a big contract over it all, but it was a contract. It was a kind of contract between the people of our society, and as a result of this reckoning of that what had happened before was indefensible and had these consequences, not just for the direct victims of it, but for the whole society. One of the most remarkable things about that period is that from 1970 until the late 1990s, if you are honest about quantitatively the condition of Americans in terms of wealth and education and job profiles and all those sorts of indices of the vigor of a society and economy, if you're honest about where things were in 1970, and then you look at where they were by just 1990, just 20 years later, and if you go to 2000, even more so the case, what you have in that period of time among African Americans, because 1970 is really the first moment that you can argue, it's still not quite correct, but that's the first point that you can argue, okay, all black people in America, for the most part, have some sort of access to the most important levers of achievement. All black people in America are somehow or another ought to be able to find their way to a school that would do right by them in some fashion. And they have some possibility of getting loans for a business or a house that they want to buy. But these mechanisms that have been used to create wealth and achievement by Americans for so long, but had been excluded from people who were not descendants of Europe, those finally become available in some meaningful way, not before 1970. That's really the starting point. And the accomplishments, the sort of quantifiable accomplishments in terms of wealth accumulation, educational attainment, and all those kinds of things over the next 20 years, 30 years on the part of African Americans are unparalleled, again, I think, in human history. I don't think you can point at an ethnically identifiable group of people at any other point in time in all of human history who accomplish as much in that period of time as what happens in the United States. It's a kind of miraculous thing. And that was all a part of this kind of organic opening up of society to include a whole lot of people who had been excluded before. And that was the contract. That was the deal that had been arrived at. And then we quickly, we're not even halfway through that period of time when, again, the dominant forces of society began to say, well, this is too much, this is too much. And my son didn't get into the law school that he wanted to get into. And, and my son is really smart. And it must be that he didn't get into the law school because that African-American guy did and took his spot. And the assumption was so prevalent that not just white people, but white males specifically, the assumption was so prevalent that white males will always be the highest scorers in every kind of test. And of course, when the tests are sort of designed to that outcome, then that's even more likely to be the case. But there was this completely dominant assumption, particularly among white people, but really inculcated into the whole society, that, yeah, white males are always going to be the highest achievers. And so it's sort of impossible that on merit alone, more than a tiny number of non-white males can actually qualify for the most prestigious places and the most prestigious schools or the best jobs or the best opportunities. And so almost as soon as we start having this kind of remarkable, very low-cost success in terms of trying to deal with this legacy, we begin to doubt it, and begin to curb it. And people begin to exploit it politically. People begin to come along and say, well, hey, why there's not slavery anymore, and there's not segregation anymore, and black folks get to go to, the schools they want to go to, and they get to vote, and they get to do all this other stuff, and now you even get to, and we even elected a president who was black. So why does there have to be this thing that, that gives them some sort of advantage, in some fashion? Why does there have to be a television network that's theirs? There's no white television network, is there? Fox News, but and now several others. But we begin to, for really very irrational reasons, begin to see a threat in the good that was being accomplished, and then people begin to seize upon the opportunity that perception of threat presented politically, and so we dismantle that compact. Basically, we dismantle that compact. We haven't completely dismantled it, but we largely dismantle it. We largely take those things away. And by the time you get to the mid-1990s, and Newt Gingrich emerges as in great opposition to Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton sort of represents, as president, whatever one thinks about him and Monica and all that. But aside from that, tawdry business, but Bill Clinton is sort of the last, even though you can criticize much about him as well, but he does represent the last Democratic president who was still felt deeply invested in that compact that had been arrived at in the 1970s. And Newt Gingrich emerges as the counterpoint, the absolute counterpoint to that point of view. And then very openly says, we're going to do away with affirmative action, we're going to do away with all of these different things. And that in fact these are discriminatory. That in fact these things that are designed to make our society work better, and that are making our society work better, are actually discriminatory and are injuring white people because my son didn't get into law school that he wanted to get into. I'll very quickly just tell this one thing. I started years ago whenever I would talk about this affirmative action thing. I started saying to audiences sometimes, and sometimes it would happen in a question that someone would ask me after I talked, and I would end up saying, well, so I keep trying to find this white guy, whose life was wrecked by affirmative action. I have heard that, there are all these white guys out there whose lives were really, that affirmative action did them wrong somehow. But I keep trying to find them, and I keep asking people, do you know them, or do you know one? But who is somebody, who actually was injured by affirmative action? And every now and then, I start down that road. And obviously, I'm being a little comical about it, but it's kind of a serious question. I'm curious, and every now and then somebody in the audience will say, well, okay, me, and they never say anybody else, but they'll say, yeah, I'm that guy. And I'll say, okay, well, tell us, tell us how affirmative action wrecked your life, or really hurt you in this terrible way. And it's always the exact same story. I mean, there are a few details that are different, but that just driven by geography. It's always a man, and he always says, well, in 1978, I graduated from wherever, got my undergraduate degree, and whatever city this conversation is happening in, I wanted to go to Northwestern Law School, whatever the designated best law school in that neck of the woods, and I was going to go to Northwestern Law School just like my dad went, and I was denied admission because of affirmative action, and I said, oh well, I can understand your frustration. Okay, I get that. You had this thing that you really wanted and felt like you deserved, and you worked hard for, and you made good scores. I'm just assuming all these things, but I suspect they're true, and I can understand that was frustrating to you. And then I'll say, but do you know for sure that it was affirmative action? Are you certain? Did somebody? Because how exactly do you know that? Did the school release more information than we're accustomed to about exactly why this person got in, this person, but how do you know exactly? Of course, they never actually know. And I'll say, well, but let's just assume that that's what it was, And then I'll say, but so I understand your frustration. Then I'll say, well, what have you been doing? That was back in 1978, what have you been doing the last 30 years, as you've been nursing, this injury, trying to get over this terrible, devastating development in your life, so what have you been doing? You look good. You look prosperous, so I don't think you're working in construction, but what have you been doing? Laying tile? What? That's good money. And they say, oh, I'm a lawyer. And the first time that happened, I cocked my head back. Literally, you're a lawyer. I thought you couldn't go to law school. Are you a criminal lawyer, like not a lawyer, criminally acting like a lawyer? How are you a lawyer if you couldn't go to law school? How does that work? Oh, well, I went to, B+ law school in whatever territory this is in. I went to the, indistinguishably equally good law school that people like me go to. And I'll go, oh, okay. So you were mildly inconvenienced, You had this faint aspiration that didn't matter at all, but you didn't get it. You didn't get the color balloon you wanted on your birthday. And that is the basis of that's your evidence that things like affirmative action are harmful, as opposed to the revolution in American jurisprudence that came as a result of there suddenly being almost no African-American lawyers in America, and almost absolutely no African-American lawyers who had attended Harvard Law and the most elite, most prestigious schools in the country. And the fact that we went from that to what was the case even by the late 1970s, early 1980s, it just revolutionized everything in the American law. Everything that today is actually just, even with all of the injustice that remains in our legal system, everything just that has happened in the last 30, 40 years is primarily because there are now thousands of extraordinarily talented and well-qualified African-American lawyers and judges. That is what changed everything profoundly. And that happened because of those affirmative action type things. And that's just one example of all those things. And so by the time you get to the late 1990s, when misguided people, I'll give them, I'll accept that people just didn't realize the consequences of what they were doing and saying. They were just being cynical and selfish to some degree, but they weren't evil necessarily. Whatever, I'll accept some version of that. But they began to dismantle all those things. And that did drive this conversation. That drove this moment that came in September of 2001, where Jesse Jackson says, okay, we have to turn the full force of the civil rights movement to this thing where they have broken the contract. They have abandoned the contract, and they're going to take it further and further apart. And so it's time to change what we say. It's time for us to say, okay, well, just cut a check. If we tried to do this a peaceable way, but let's just settle up. Let's calculate how much money was stolen from our ancestors and how much opportunity was taken from me alive and standing in front of you because of this system and this legacy. Let's just count all that up the way we would in a lawsuit over a traffic accident in which somebody gets killed. Let's calculate the economic value of these things that were done, and then let's just settle it up, and that's what began to drive that conversation. And so that day, the American Civil Rights Movement says, okay, that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to pursue. And now let's go get on our planes and go back to America. And that was on September the 8th, September the 9th, 2001. And we get back to the United States, 9/11 happens, and all of that just vanishes. All of that just vanishes. It's another 10 years before there's any real conversation again about any of those things. And by the time those 10 years have gone by, the contract, well, I mean, there are remnants of the contract that are still there. The fact that there's some diversity in this room right now speaks to that, we haven't gone back to 1962. We haven't gone back to an apartheid state, which is what Arkansas, where I grew up in Mississippi, was in the middle of the 1960s. We haven't done that. And we have a kind of casual, informal, kindly association with one another. And we, the odds that young people have baked into them really nefarious racial ideas, like was the case when I was a kid, and we've eliminated from the landscape the most raging, obvious white supremacist, racist, and we've gotten rid of the Klan, and for the most part, until very recently. So we haven't gone all the way back, but we have arrived at this place where it is such an uphill climb to have even a serious discussion about how any of these things could be proactively, affirmatively, constructively worked on, and that it even is that we're not. It's like the mask, the no mask mandate rule in Georgia, where I live. Is that I can't tell my students to wear a mask, and really it's best if I just don't speak of masks. And that's how this has sort of become, these questions of the compact in our society. And I'm going to bring this to an end because I've gone much longer than I intended to, but you guys let me. It's your fault. But the harm of all this, of course, is the most obvious harm of this, are things like that we've ended up in this society that has a paradox at its center that actually did not exist before, did not exist in an earlier time. And there was an earlier time in which it was always the case that an African-American man was a lot more likely, when confronted by a police officer, was much more likely to have some really terrible thing happen to him than to same guy who's white in the same circumstance. That was always the case. But in the past, in the further back past, that was consistent with everything else. That was consistent with an apartheid society. The society didn't claim that wasn't going to happen. The justice system that existed even in the 1950s and into the 1960s was one that was designed to be unjust to African Americans. It was designed to be just to white people and unjust to black people. It was baked into the code, the source code of how the system worked. And people only in the most sort of hollow ways even claimed that wasn't the case. And so the worst things that happened were actually consistent with the broader values of the society. But now we have a paradox in which we actually accomplished a lot. Things are, in fact, despite the things that we sometimes feel at really bad moments, things are a lot better today than they were in 1965. There's just no getting around that. There's no doubt about that. When I was in the first class of children in Mississippi to begin the first day of first grade with black and white kids together and go all 12 grades together. That was my grade. They graduated in 1982, really not all that long ago. But before 1970, before the year we started first grade, my black classmates still couldn't go to the library in my town. It was just shocking, And their classmates, I'm making a documentary film that digs into all of this right now. That'll come out on PBS in 2023. But there are interviews that we've done with classmates of mine, African American classmates who still didn't have running water or electricity at their homes in 1977, 78, 79. When we were going into high school. And so the kinds of disparities that existed then and that people had no concern about whatsoever that don't exist today, those are meaningful changes. Those are meaningful differences. But nonetheless, we've arrived at this place where it's obvious, watch one of the videos. I mean, we didn't have to see the George Floyd video to already know what we already knew, but any one of those things, but what was so powerful about the George Floyd video was that any shred of reservation that you had about, oh, actually, there's not really a problem, and these other things that have happened, it's actually the black guy's fault somehow, or but it's really not. There's really not the problem that crazy liberals are claiming is the case. George Floyd video was that thing that was impossible to square that with those kinds of denials that we had. And so this paradox that we have today that we didn't have a generation ago is that on the one hand, we've accomplished so much, and we actually have a lot of consensus around some big, broad ideas. Nobody thinks that slavery should come back. Nobody thinks that black people shouldn't be allowed to vote, or certainly don't think that shouldn't be a law. But there are these basic things that we essentially have accomplished in terms of the attitudes of the society. And yet, if right now somebody came in here and interrupted me, as you're all hoping someone will do, if somebody came in right now and interrupted and said, hey, the terrible thing has happened in Little Rock, there was this incident between a police officer and a black man, and now, I don't know what the neighborhood would be today, but this neighborhood is up in arms, and there are all sorts of terrible things happening in the streets, and we would go, oh gosh, that's really, I hate that, But we would not go, I can't believe it. What? That can't be happening. Not in my town, not in my state. We would not have that reaction. We'd go, oh, well, yeah, I guess it was eventually going to happen. So we have this weird thing where in some respects we're the most egalitarian and most advanced society in the world, which we really are in many respects on these questions. And yet at the same time, we expect disaster at any minute with good reason, with good reason. And so we've ended up in this place, this incredibly tangled place that's full of contradictions, and which good people also believe bad things, and bad people know how to sound like they believe good things, and we don't know what a truth is, much less what the truth is. So we arrived at this place, and so the question of how to dismantle racism, why I was actually here, is related to that whole story, but it also fundamentally comes down to that, and I'm not going to go back into my whole argument of exactly how 9/11 amplified these things, but 9/11 did further wreck our sense of invincibility as a society, that the idea that we were, even with all our flaws, that we were still righteous somehow, and that even as untrue in many respects as that actually was, but that still, that confidence in a kind of righteousness of the American idea, at least, is an incredibly powerful thing, is an incredible motivation toward trying to actually accomplish some version of that righteousness, some fully defensible version of that righteousness. And 9/11 really shattered that. It shattered our sense of invincibility. It also, if you were conservative, if you were a kind of George Bush believer, if you really believed that, well, the way to deal with problem people in the world is force, and we've got the greatest force that there is, well, we saw that turn out disastrously. So from the perspective of whichever thing you believed in, whether you believed in goodness as the fuel for progress, or if you believed in force and rules and compliance as the way to achieve a better future, both of those things, both of those ways have been assaulted by the history that we've lived in the last 20 years, in the last 30 years. And so I think we're really adrift in the midst of all that. I think the reason Barack Obama was elected president was not because America was ready for a black president. It was because America realized that what had been happening immediately before him was not working. We've finally seen the ultimate fruition of it. But what was happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, the response to 9/11 had been a big, giant mess in which thousands of people were dying and hundreds of thousands of other people were dying, and was not accomplishing what our force and righteousness was supposed to have accomplished. And it was in this rejection of all that suddenly created, yes, let's do something totally different. Even, and along comes the most, maybe the other most brilliant person I've ever met. By the way, I have spent a little time around President Obama, and he is, in fact, exactly as cool and incredible as you may think. Really mind-boggling, actually, just how much he really is who you think he is. But so that's really what in my mind, his presidency came about in significant part because of the trauma of 9/11, the disruption to our sense of ourselves that came from 9/11. And then that then triggered a trauma, for another group of people within our society. And that's what then led us to this swinging pendulum of where we then went and where we are now. And so my point in all of that is that I don't have a 3-point plan. I don't have there isn't a formula for dismantling racism except for the first part. That is absolutely, whatever you think the 6th step is or the 12th step might be, the first step is honesty. Is honesty. And a kind of confrontational honesty, not for the point of confrontation, but it takes confrontation to be honest. You have to be willing to say, as many people did during the Black Lives Matter protest, to look at themselves and say, oh, I have been a good person who didn't do any obviously bad things. As a white person, I wasn't out there injuring anybody, but I also wasn't doing anything to move the ball. And I didn't go to the defense of anybody in a situation that would have cost me anything. And I mean, that was the most profound thing in terms of the effect on white Americans that I saw in that period of time. That's faded a little bit, but I still think there's something there. But that's a kind of confrontational honesty. And we have to be willing to be somewhat confrontational about that. Oh, my grandfather, who was the banker and gave lots of money to these things that have his name on it and sound good and were good in their own way. Oh, but his bank also wouldn't loan any money to certain groups of people who wanted to live in certain places. And do I need to now reach into my own bank account and try to make that right, financially? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. But do I need to know that and deal with it somehow? Yes. And so that's the first step to whatever may be the way that we can dismantle racism. And also, finally, that's the first step to having this conversation in an environment in which we are ruthlessly honest about the past, the distant past and the recent past. We're ruthlessly honest about it and what it might mean. But then we turn and move into a kind of ruthless effort to design the future, to not only be preoccupied with the bad things that happened. We need to know all that. We need to know all that. We have to understand all that for many reasons. But then we have to use that understanding to try to design a future. And if I've got a prescription, that's it. So I'll stop there. Thank you for being patient with me. And I'm happy to take any questions on. I'll try to make my answers much more concise than I've been thus far. And I think maybe if there are online questions, we can do that too. But
we do.
All right.
We do have a couple questions from online. The first one is, Congress can't agree on immigration reform. I expect any plan to pay reparations to descendants of former slaves to go no place. How would reparations for Black Americans dismantle racism?
Well, that's a version of the basic basic question of how would this work, and I can rattle off a long list of impracticalities to why it would be really difficult to. I mean, the first question really is, what does reparations mean? What are we actually talking about? Are we talking about a check that would be cut to every descendant of an enslaved person in America? How do we establish who everybody is and what they connect back to? What do we do about people who were, or the descendants of people who were enslaved in other countries? American slavery is actually really closely patterned on British slavery in what we used to call the West Indies, and they're like, I'm writing a book right now. My co-author is Eric Holder, the former Attorney General, and a big part of the book is about his family and the history of his family, and they all come from Barbados, and it's this story of slavery and and the effects of slavery over time, but it's not American slavery. So would Eric Holder and his daughters, would they be eligible for reparations? Of what kind would we be talking about? So there are these practical complexities that we're not very good at in our society. And just like in the COVID relief stuff, one of the things that came up was people began to say, well, gosh, why is everybody getting this check? As opposed to the people who really need it. Well, the actual answer to that is because it's too complicated to figure out, who needs it and who needs it more, or whatever. So it's like, okay, and the real goal is just to pump a huge amount of money out into the economy and keep the wheels turning anyway. Well, that's not what reparations are supposed to be for. So how would we, that's just one instance kind of practical complexity, and so what's it going to be? How would it work? Those are all very reasonable questions. That was why that social compact that I talked about that came before was a much better way of doing things and was very, very effective. And if you ask me to be more specific about the future, I'd say that to go back to a version of all that, a much more robust version of all that, is actually the more effective way to try to achieve some of the same ends. But it may be that something that we call reparations is the only way to get at that. As far as the fact that there's no way Congress, if it was voting on it tomorrow, would pass any version of this thing, I'm sure that that's true. If you can't pass a bill to fix bridges that are about to collapse, then you probably can't get a majority to pass something like this. But that's a bit of a cop-out. The reality is that if that's the case, then these things need to get sorted out. We need to decide who we are as a people and as a nation. Are we going to be the people that has a big giant wall on the border that really does keep everybody out except for the ones who go through the gate and have gotten all the permissions? Are we going to be that, or are we not going to be that? And if we're not that, what are we going to be? And we have to decide those things, and we need to get to a place that majorities of us share values that answer some of those questions, and that in defensible ways. And so if we're going to go down this route toward racial equity, then somebody has to put forward the plan, and we have to build consensus around it, and it has to withstand the test and the scrutiny of other people. But that's how democracy works. And one thing about democracies is that they don't always end up in a tie. They stay frozen only when some people are excluded from participation, and when some tiny group controls and dominates everything. That's when a democracy gets stuck somewhere. But operating naturally, democracies, move around and arrive at new ideas and new consensus, and that's what needs to happen. And so I don't have a specific answer to it, but I'm sure that the person is right that you wouldn't be able to pass any version of this tomorrow, but that's why people need to get to work, and figure out what should be passed and assemble a majority around it. It would be my response. Question from in the room? Can I call on Dr. Larson? Make him, he used to call on me. Dr. Larson, surely you have a question? Oh, we'll go one over here. You're saved. Oh, no. All right.
Given what you just said, it seems like maybe the voter restriction movement may be the first thing, and perhaps maybe the most important thing, that would allow us permission for democracy to work and finally address these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I live in Georgia, which it's not quite ground zero at the moment now of the voter restriction debate, but it certainly set the pattern for these laws that have been passed in Texas and other places, and people can quibble about this. And again, this is something where when you get into the details, you can argue about is, well, but the Georgia law is still less restrictive in terms of early voting than the state of New York is, and the state of New York's liberal, so, then you must be full of crap, to criticize the Georgia law. We get into all this nonsensical, false discussion. But the bottom line is that, yeah, the promise of our system is that everybody gets to vote. Everybody who of a certain age gets to vote. And whenever there are any kind of structures that substantially make that substantially more difficult, then we're really screwing with democracy. Our voting has always been messy. Voting is messy. Anything that involves 150 million people doing the same thing on the same day is a messy thing. If you try to serve French fries to 150 million people on the same day, a lot of people are not going to get their order right, or not going to get it on time, or whatever. It's not possible to have a perfect thing that involves 150 million transactions on the same day. So there will always be these kinds of things, and there always have been. It's just that it doesn't matter when there are majorities, when there is consensus. And in the past, it was consensus around some terrible ideas, But the main solution to that reality of the messiness of democracy is just that people have to be persuasive with each other and have to be confrontationally honest, And by that, I really don't mean ugly, but I mean, we have to be really honest and push people to reconsider their views and their values. But the very first step of that is to say, and surely you don't support the idea that it should be a lot harder for these kinds of folks to vote than these kinds of folks over here, And anybody who is unwilling to see the truth of some of those things is just being dishonest. But yeah, I agree. That's the bedrock. And without it, in Reconstruction, there was a time when there were hundreds of thousands of African American men who were voting, but in fact were not. Their votes were being stolen. Corrupt. That's actually the heyday of American corrupt politics. But yeah, honest voting in which everybody who wants to vote gets to vote, and that have reasonable requirements to establish that you have that right. That's the system we have to have. And anybody who really is getting in the way of that is not a friend to democracy.
Hello. As I was kind of reflecting on your remarks, one question that came to my mind was the importance of stories and how they get told. That there may be racist structures that exist, but they don't get changed unless those stories change. 9/11, like, why did they hate us? The story of the Confederate flag, what that means, why and how the Civil War happened. I'm curious about, looking on your own professional experience in journalism, it's the first draft of history, how those stories get told. And looking back on your career and where journalism is now, what would you say has changed in terms of what the newsroom looks like, and what still needs to change?
Well, it doesn't look very good in journalism in many respects. Now, I don't say that I'm not quite as forlorn about that today as I might have been a few years ago. I always, for a long time now, I've referred to myself in terms of that question about kind of the state of journalism and such. I refer to myself as an apocalyptic optimist. And what I mean by that is that, we went into an apocalyptic period, an absolutely apocalyptic period in which, really nothing is the same. There's hardly anything that's even vaguely the same to what it was when I was relatively new out of Hendrix College. And so this apocalyptic event has just sort of cleared away everything and the way that everything worked, some of which was not all bad. I mean, you had the business structure. I won't go into all the details of this, but the economics of media and journalism were always incredibly vulnerable. Relied on a really kind of weird set of structures to make the whole thing go, and so it was no surprise that when technology altered all of that the whole thing just fell over. And it wasn't just that really was not because of nefarious corporations or Rupert Murdoch buying the Wall Street Journal and corrupting it. It really was not a conspiracy. it was that radio is better than the telegraph, and television is better than radio, and all the vehicles that we have today work better at getting information to people and connecting people than did newspapers or television or radio. You know, it really is just that's the core thing that has happened. Now, on top of that, in the apocalypse, you then have, you know, there are always profiteers who see opportunity in the apocalypse, and so you then have these malevolent, you know, profiteers coming into the picture, and that's essentially what Fox News is today. Not to offend anybody, but the strangest thing in the current environment is that Fox News is, you know, is actually much better than the other things now that exist beyond it, Newsmax and News One and these other hyper right-wing propaganda machines, which really are part of larger conspiracies and such. But the core thing that is needed is not so much what should the newsroom look like, or, you know, those kinds of mechanical things, but is again back to what is it that we want? You know what is it that the society wants? When not very many people read very well, and not very many people had much access to immediate information, or even information that was 2 or 3 days old, you know, which is just the world of my grandparents when they were my age. In that world, it's pretty clear that, yeah, we need these kind of gatekeeper people who are not all that sophisticated, you know, these newspaper reporters and types who are not all that better informed than the readers, but a little bit better, and they get trained in this storytelling and sort of how to figure out what's the most essential information that will be the most interesting. And there was this calculation that, well, what's most interesting to people is also probably what's most important. And when you're really focused on who the president's going to be, then that kind of works in a way. But now, weirdly enough, some of this is a byproduct of our diversity. You know, that when you begin to have a society that, oh, now everybody can read, and everybody has some resources, and everybody cares about, everybody wants to buy a new car. And so you have all kinds of different people, women, not just men, you know, making these decisions and wanting these kinds of information. And we had this information structure that was not designed to do that, and not designed to incorporate the range of kinds of Americans and interests that we had. And so part of what's happened that looks really destabilizing is actually a kind of opening up of things and bringing more people in. And we have brought, I mean, as weird as the last few years have been, it's also been a period where my cousins of mine in rural North Louisiana who never voted, never had any interest in politics, felt completely ostracized from society, just got angry whenever they watched the TV, but also had no mechanism for expressing their frustration. But that, you know, every time they watched a movie, what they heard in every movie was, you know, you talk funny, so there's something wrong with you, and you must be racist, and, you know, and the world doesn't like you. You know, that's what they heard from everything. The world wasn't really saying that. Sometimes it was, but it wasn't saying it as much as they thought. But they couldn't do anything about it, you know, for the longest time, because they were so isolated and separated. And so they didn't really have much effect. You know, their kind of ignorance and bad instincts, in a way, didn't matter very much. And I could sort of naively think that, well, you know, Ricky, I wish Ricky didn't think that way, but he's not doing anything bad. And so I'm not going to be confrontationally honest with him. And, you know, his kids are going to be different from him. And, you know, so I can count on that, you know. But instead, you know, Facebook came along, you know, and all of a sudden, you know, he's able to connect into the world, and he's able to see things. He begins to get scripts that he never would have quite been able to articulate himself, but that he sees these things in social media and says, yeah, that's what I think. You know, that is voicing my frustration. I'm going to resend that. And boy, this is going to get my cousin Doug's goat. You know, that's going to be kind of fun, you know, to see Doug get worked up about this, you know. And but something more sinister has also then evolved out of that, you know, maybe there was a version of that, you know, that was kind of harmless in a way. But now, you know, bad actors have recognized that, that guy on Blackman Road, you know, out in the middle of nowhere in North Louisiana, you know, he's part of my army now. You know, and if he keeps repeating these memes and keeps saying these things, and his kids actually are going to be they're not breaking away, even though they went to a better school and they're better educated than their father was, and they actually have some economic opportunity that he never had. They are equally, they feel as aggrieved as their father, aggrieved over things that, didn't happen, that didn't exist, and this sort of subculture in which people look around and say, well, gosh, if you actually read the writings of Dylan Roof, that sad, pathetic young man who killed all his people in the church in Charleston, if you actually read the things that he wrote, you can actually kind of see into this crazy, tormented psychology that is shared in other ways, and thankfully less severely in most cases. But this kind of logic that says, okay, I'm arriving in young adulthood and things don't seem right to me, and I know I'm kind of a screw up, and I know that I haven't done anything except smoke pot the last 5 years, and I didn't go to school with any regularity, and I did everything that I actually knew was not going to advance me in any way. But my dad was a screw up too, but there was a spot for him, in the world, there was a place for him. Well, and there was a place for him, because even in the 1980s, Dad Roof, I'm making these parts up, but Dad Roof, if he went down to the chicken plant or or some nearby factory, he still got to be at the front of the line, just because he was white. Nobody said that, but if he wanted a job in that place where you could get a job in that county, then he was going to get it because he was white, even though he was a screw up, and he was going to get it before this African American guy, who actually was a better qualified person. That's how it was still going to work out. And so in the mind of Dylan Roof, it's like, well, my dad was a screw up and he's in jail all the time, but there was still a spot for him. But it feels like there's not a spot for me, and so there's got to be some explanation for this. And the explanation can't be, I've been smoking pot for the last 10 years and screwed everything up that I could screw up. That's not an explanation I like. And so it becomes, well, somebody else caused this. Somebody has done this to me. That's my grievance. And then when somebody comes along and says, yeah, you're right, it's black people. It's black people and it's Mexicans. They are the ones who did that. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that becomes and so what the real challenge is reaching some sort of consensus, some sort of new consensus about how we want truth to arrive and what the package that truth is in looks like. And then how do we proselytize to one another that this is how you can tell what's true or what represents a shared value in our society. And then we have to teach that in a way that we once did. We used to teach that in civics classes and things like that. And so we have to find some sort of consensus around those sorts of things, hopefully in a way that my cousins who felt ostracized from the political process all of their lives, and their father did too, hopefully in a way that actually it's good for them and their children to become part of the democracy, and to participate. But we got to figure out a way that they are able to participate in a constructive way. And I don't even mean that as that they have to vote for who I want them to vote for, but they have to have something other than these imaginary grievances that motivate them. So I'm not sure I really answered your question, but we'll go to the online folk.
We have one that asks, how do you manage these discussions and actions against racism and avoid traps of white supremacy? How are you cognizant of and evade the white savior idea in your line of work?
Well, that's a good question, and something I'm actually that I think a lot about. One of the best things about any of the problems with any of these kinds of conversations, one of the best approaches from the get-go, goes back to my thing of that step one is always honesty, but there's a version of that that's actually sort of a pledge of honesty, even if you're not sure what honesty means, but to start off all of these sorts of conversations with a willingness to say, I may get it wrong, I may be wrong about parts of this, or I may miss things that I shouldn't miss, but I am going to be honest. I'm as best as I can be honest, I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be honest about myself. I'm going to be open to the idea that I might be getting something wrong, or that people that I love might have done things wrong, or that there are people who are both good and bad in different ways. And so just this kind of intent to be honest is really the thing before the actual honest. But in terms of white supremacy, and sort of one thing and some people really dislike the next thing I'm going to say, but is that we're all white supremacists. We're all white supremacists. Everybody in America is a white supremacist, no matter what color we are. We're all white supremacists. And what I mean by that is that the notion of white supremacy, the notion that, and usually when you say white supremacy, what comes to mind immediately is the Klan, is the Ku Klux Klan, people who think that way, people who hate non-white people. That's what we think white supremacy means. And I guess that is a kind of white supremacy. But the most basic definition of white supremacy is that if you're somebody who, when you look at the world, if you just notice this pattern in your workplace, that when jobs are posted, and there are black people and white people who apply for the jobs, and you see people come in and get interviews and such, but it always, almost always turns out that the person hired is white, or just much more frequently than, and more than just the proportion of the population. But if white people keep getting these jobs, or only white men, or only white women, whatever it is, but if those things are happening, and your reaction in your mind is some version of, yeah, just how it all, it's just, yeah, it's not really any sort of outrage, but just it's just unfortunate, but yeah, that's just how it turns out, that's how it always seems to go. It's a little bit like and this is always a little unfair in the academic world, but, whenever one points out that, there's never been an African-American professor in the history department, or, any version of that, the first response is always, well, there are just so few African-American PhDs, and particularly here at a really elite university like where I was for many years, the University of Virginia, it's just only a tiny number of white historians who really are qualified to work here, and so it's even tinier number of non-whites, and Harvard wants them too, and Princeton wants them, and it's not that there's anything about the way we look for them or value people that is leading to this outcome. It's all this other stuff, and that's why there hasn't been one for 100 years. It's just like, one of the places I once worked, after I started working there, one day I heard this voice down the hall after I'd been there for a few months, and I realized I didn't recognize it immediately, but it was so distinctive, and I started listening to it, and I said, this is incredibly familiar to me, and then I realized it actually was a voice that was like the voice of the accent and the tonality of the African-American women, very, very distinctive kind of audible markers of the African-American women who worked in the houses of white families in the little town that I grew up in Mississippi. And it was this very specific Mississippi Delta accent that I think was, even more specific than that. And I heard this accent, and I thought, well, who is that? That's really interesting. And then I got up and walked in the hallway, I looked in, and it was the cleaning lady, And then I realized that, okay, this is actually, I'm working in this building, which actually was an old plantation house where there had once been a slave population, in the last years of Thomas Jefferson's life, not far from Monticello, So I mean, this was we were in a house on a slave plantation, and I realized that of the 50 employees in the building, I had not really thought it through, but the only black person who worked in the building was this cleaning lady, And this is at one of the most progressive-minded elite institutions in the country. And so finally, at some point in a staff meeting, there was a job opening being discussed for an accounting job, a professional position, but not a PhD, not a scholar sort of thing. And the chief operating officer was just saying something about it, and here's the job description, pass this around to people, get this. And I said, well, it seems like for a job like this that it's really weird that all the, it's one thing to talk about the shortage of PhDs who, fit a particular profile over here. But there's no shortage of a lot of different kinds of people, for all these other jobs here. So why is it that the finalists for these jobs are always turn out to be the same? So if you're somebody who it doesn't cross your mind that that's kind of odd, well then that's white supremacy. Your baked-in expectation is that things just always kind of work out better for white people, and And that's just kind of how it is, and that's not necessarily a sign of something sinister. That's just kind of how it is. And that idea is so fundamental to American culture and American society going back for so long that it's impossible not to have been infected by that idea in some way. It's just impossible not to have that DNA lurking somewhere. So it's not a question of whether we all carry some piece of that could end up influencing a decision we make in terms of how we react to somebody or how we assess a job applicant or 1,000 other things, who we feel romantically inclined to, whatever it might be. It's no surprise that we all are carrying around some bit of that DNA, and it's no surprise that even African Americans, having relentlessly received this message of that's just nature, that's just the way the world works, and that's why you're supposed to go along with it. And so it's no surprise that we all have a little bit of that genetic code baked into us. The question is, how do we respond to it? How do we, are we willing to be aware of it? Are we willing to be on guard about it? Are we willing to spot it and say, oh, wow, how blind of me, and that's so that's my answer to the question, is that a consciousness of those things is really important, and certainly to white savior complex, which can mean many things to many different people, but I try to be very aware of that. I don't speak for anybody other than myself. I don't speak for any groups of people. I don't claim to. I understand some things better than some other people do, but I also know that there are a lot of things I don't understand, and I'll keep trying to, but that's the only way to guard against it. Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, with like us being young people, how would you, I guess, recommend having those conversations with people who are older than us? Because I know, like, some of my grandparents and a lot of my friends' grandparents have these ideas baked into them that you were kind of talking about that are blatantly racist at times. But sometimes when it's their grandkid or something, they're just like, oh, they're brainwashed by like the school they go to or something like that. So how would you recommend having those conversations and kind of avoiding those ideas that they have or going around them so that they take it seriously?
Yeah, I understand that dilemma very much, and it's not just for young people. It's everybody has a story these days, whichever side of the equation you're on. Everybody. My cousin Ricky, I'm sure, has been telling stories to his friends about this crazy liberal cousin of his, and who flies off the handle at every little thing, and sees racism everywhere. So he feels the same way that you do. About things in the opposite direction, and that's a real challenge, because that's when a democracy really, it's not at its end there, but it's at the place where the right combination, right in the bad sense, but a certain combination of really skillful evil people who I don't want to, the exact politics of this don't matter, and if you disagree with how I obviously feel about President Trump, then I respect that, and I don't have to have an argument about that, but I don't think very highly of President Trump. I'm very public about that. He is empirically the worst president we've ever had in American history, certainly the worst president in modern history. Devastating effect on American life, American society, American position in the world. I think those are all historical facts. But it's okay, though, if you don't agree with me on that. But based on how I view him, I am just so thankful that he was so unskilled at so many things, that he was not a better propagandist. I'm so thankful that he was surrounded by these fools, these incredibly ineffective fools. And if you try to imagine, again, the Nazi comparisons get a little wearisome, but if you take Goebbels, if you take Hitler's propagandist, this incredibly effective and talented propagandist, and you attach somebody like that to a person, whether it's Donald Trump or somebody else, but someone who, for whatever reason, has a kind of charismatic following that if you put the right functionality with that intangible, well, that's a really dangerous thing. And when we get to this place that grandchildren and grandparents are, refusing to speak to one another, that really is a severe thing. That's the kind of thing that, in the past, there would be this idea that, well, okay, we used to all be Baptists, but now you're Presbyterians. And I mean, my family, the primitive Baptists in my family, when my family became Presbyterians, well, they all said, well, you're all going to hell, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You're going to hell. But we still talked to each other. We didn't have any expectation of meeting in the afterlife, but we kept talking. And so when we get to this place that so many people have found themselves in recent years, of where I don't know how many times somebody has said to me, yeah, well, I just cut them all off. I unfriended all of them. And they're talking about their cousins. Talking about the people they spent the summers with year after year after year. And when you get to a place that is happening to millions of people in these kinds of circumstances, then that's a very dangerous thing. That's an opening to really bad things. And so what I would say is that I don't know the exact answer, and the answer is a little different, probably in every single situation, but a consciousness of that grandchildren and grandparents should be talking to each other, and both ends of that equation and the people in the middle should be trying to find ways that those people are still talking to each other, because the single biggest antidote to all of the worst things that human beings ever do, this is going to sound trite perhaps, but the big antidote to everything is just love. It's just love. It's just care. And the only way that we really understand love and care is in that equation, of between ourselves and our siblings and our parents and our grandparents. And when that begins to be corroded and corrupted, and we begin to lose track of why that matters, why care for one another matters, even when they do things we don't like. When we start getting to this point, screw that, I'm not talking, that's when then we're really vulnerable. That's when Dylan Roof can happen. And so and sometimes that involves making a hard decision. My father, when he finally got on Facebook, I cajoled him to finally figure out how to do Facebook for years, and he was like, but I said, well, if you want to know what your grandchildren are doing, you really ought to get on Facebook, because they're not on Facebook anymore, but their parents are, and so if you want to know what's happening in their high school, that's the way, because nobody's going to write you a letter about what's going on anymore. And so finally he gets on Facebook and starts seeing all this stuff. But and my father is an uncharacteristic kind of human being, and I admire this part of him. But typically as we get older, we get more conservative. That's kind of a traditional thing. But my father is exactly the opposite. And the older he gets, the more just lunatic left wing he becomes. He's so far beyond my politics in many respects. But he also, as a 85-year-old man in Troy, New York, he's also actually accomplishing a lot in that. I think it's really kind of remarkable. But at first, when he got on Facebook, and he was seeing this stuff that my cousins were posting, and some of our relatives that were, some of which was just this horrifying repetition of these terrible memes and things that weren't even what our cousins were thinking. It was just this trafficking in this garbage, this terrible garbage. Well, my father started, he became very confrontationally honest. He was jumping in there and, no, that's wrong, and hectoring all of them. And that would lead to these online explosions and such. But at times, some of what he was doing began to look a lot like what they were doing, this kind of out of control anger about these things. So finally, at some point, I got on the phone with him one night after he'd posted something that even he immediately realized was really the wrong thing to have posted. And I said, look, Dad, just 2 questions. And I don't think he'd be mad at me for telling this story. He doesn't like it when I tell the story of when I told him I was going to major in English at Hendrix, and what his response was. And his response to me then was, well, that's your decision, Doug, but I would hate to see a mind as good as yours go to waste. Now, he overcame that and later became an advocate for the liberal arts. But so I said to him about this Facebook stuff, I said, Dad, these nieces and nephews of yours and their children, number one, do you imagine that there's any kind of exchange you will ever be able to have with them in which you change their mind about these things? You actually think that you're going to be able to reform them in some way? And he said, no, probably not. I realize that I'm probably not going to be able to change it. I said, well, do you want to have any kind of relationship with these people? Do you want to know them 10 years from now? Or do you want them to care about knowing you, 10 years from now or 5 years from now, or the remaining years of your life? He said, well, yeah, I do, I said, well, then you have to stop some of this other stuff, and that ultimately this having some kind of relationship is actually a valuable thing. And it's valuable to their children and now their grandchildren to know that there's this cranky guy in New York State who's really different, but who was born on the same road as them, and that he actually cares about them for some reason. It is important for them to know that, and that there's another world out there that they could aspire to. And that's actually a lot more important than beating their father into submitting that, yeah, I was wrong about all these memes that I've posted. Who really cares ultimately about that? And so that's how you're going to do it in every situation is going to vary, but it is important. And there's some relationships that can't be salvaged, and one shouldn't try, doesn't have any burden to. But most of them, it's important to try to find a way. That is the future. That is the path out of the madness.
Okay, we've got a couple more things we can ask to wrap up. Apologies, we knew we were not going to be able to get to every question that was asked online. One of them was a comment, though. Love these students, go Warriors. So kudos to those who asked questions today in person. The one remaining question that isn't a housekeeping item from a Black listener. Have you read the book by white author Robin DiAngelo, White Fragility? And if so, how does it relate to this subject matter?
I have, and I think it relates in the sense that, one of my frustrations as a writer is that there are all these things that these things that I want to write, and for whatever reason, I have something of a gift for titles. And in fact, I'm better at titles than I am at texts, and not just because they're shorter, but I come up with titles, and that's how I actually understand things, is when I come up with a title. That's the crystallization of something for me. And so I have all of these things, all these scraps of paper, going back, frankly, to when I was at Hendrix, of titles of essays and titles of things, and sometimes a few more lines of things that I want to write, and the vast majority of which I haven't. And so when the book White Fragility came out, that was one of these things where now, but then eventually somebody else writes the thing that you're like, hey, I thought of that 25 years ago, but I never wrote it. But then somebody else does, And so White Fragility was one of those things that when that book came out, I had some of that reaction of that. And there was a kind of half-formed essay that I had scribbled on for years and years, but that the way that I would characterize it to other people would be that I just would say, white people are a race of whiners. And that was sort of my thing, the tendency of white Americans to whine. And I mean, that affirmative action story I told is a version of that. And I mean, that's the most peculiar part of this whole discussion. And I don't say that to just to insult people or to provoke them. I guess maybe a little bit, but this idea that people who have benefited so much from such a successful society, and a society whose success is, however you want to count it, rooted in bad things that happen to other people, many different types of bad people, but you end up with that, not just the good fortune of living in a society where the odds of bad things happening to you are microscopic compared to almost every other society in the world, not just the good fortune of that, but also the good fortune that you were born into it after all the ugly stuff, and the majority of the most ugly things already happened, So, none of us wake up with nightmares about what we did in the Indian Wars, in the 1870s, and so the idea that we're this society, that what has been the majority group and the economically dominant group and politically dominant group, the idea that group of people continues to see in every direction ways in which we've been done wrong, or slighted in some way, or not gotten to get the first bite of the apple because everybody else always got the first bite of the apple. That we're a society that dwells on those things at this point in our evolution as a society is pathetic, really. That's just the only word. It's just pitiful. That's where we've ended up. And that we don't have a credo. We started off with such a brilliant set of ideas that we still haven't really fulfilled, but that such genius in the organizing principles of our society. And yet we've ended up at this degraded kind of, this degraded set of shared values that is about the most trivial things. And I think that's that notion of white fragility and this kind of everything must be exactly the way that we expect it to be. And yeah, we don't want to do anything bad to anybody either, and we want other people to have good opportunities, and and anybody who does go out, some white police officer who kills a black man, that's really terrible, But I still want my first bite of the apple, That is that's a pitiful thing, and there are way too many Americans who sense that. So yeah, I think that's a very good observation of how these things relate to one another.
And before we go, before we end the online component of this event, what's a good way for folks to connect with you?
The easiest way is to, if you go to the website for the book, slaverybyanothername.com, so just one word, slaverybyanothername.com, there's a contact button on the homepage, and if you click on that, it'll send an email directly to me, and I get those emails, and I try to respond to them, and eventually do, and if I don't, do it again. But I'm actually pretty easy to find, and I teach at Georgia State, and you can find my bio on the website of Georgia State, and it's got my Georgia State email there too. So I'm pretty easy to find if people want to reach out to me. I'm not necessarily all that efficient at reading people's manuscripts and things like that, but I'm easy to reach out to. Was there any last question from in the room? And I think we probably ought to wrap things up. Yes, sir.
Yes.
I was just wondering. Oh, can I take this up? I was just wondering about your view on what happened on January 6th, and kind of how that fits into the context of your wider argument about things generally being better, because that's kind of how I saw it before January 6th, and your argument of we don't live in an apartheid state, but it's alarming how close we came. And so I'd just be interested to see
Sure.
what you think about January 6th, how real that is, and how representative of that is of our society that voted for the president that enabled that.
Yeah.
And how that fits into your wider argument and wider perspective on racism.
Yeah. Well, that's a good question and a good way to frame it. And what I would say is that one of the complicated things about any kind of honest examination of any society or any kind of social history over any period of time, the most complicated thing, and that it's always a part of the equation, no matter what era or what society you're looking at, is that contradictory things always happen at the same time. That whatever pattern begins here around this one thing, there's always something else contradictory to that that is also happening. And so single events are rarely ever are definitional. We end up obsessed with singular events because they're clear, and so they become the end point or the beginning point of some proposition conclusion that we arrive at. But in the end, it's not the one event. It's a succession of things that actually tell us something. And so, and again, I'm always reluctant when I make more than one comparison to Nazi Germany, but the reason I do that, make those comparisons, is actually because we have so much agreement about what was bad and wrong about Nazi Germany and are an equivalent kind of place. And we all share a lot of knowledge about what happened there and how humanity devolved in the way that it did. And so it's useful, it's instructive to us to try to find parallels between that experience and the things that are less clear to us. And so what I would say about January 6th is that if after Kristallnacht in Germany, if the night of broken glass and the first violent public mass attack on Jews, if after that had happened, if there had then been a kind of uprising of good in Germany strong enough to have thwarted the next things that happened. And if there had ended up being a national investigation into Kristallnacht, and somehow or another the Nazi Party had disintegrated in the pressure of all that, then if that were the case, if something like that had happened, then Kristallnacht would be this thing that would be a part of history, but it would be viewed as not inconsequential, but it would be viewed as actually this demonstration of the strength of the values at the core of this society, that good prevailed, and that at a moment when things were tipping in a terrible direction and a set of terrible things happened, that this society found its core and got back on track and dealt with that. And so I see January 6th as it's by no means the equivalent of Kristallnacht, but it maybe is closer to the Reichstag fire, but it's something that the significance of it is something that we won't know until we see what happens, and how we react to that and how we evolve from it. And our society in an earlier time, more than once, has seen terrible things happen and reacted with revulsion. We have, the murders of Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney by the Ku Klux Klan in 1965 was a gigantic thing. This depth of depravity was the trigger for this wellspring of humanity, imperfect humanity, and so really terrible things are sometimes the gateway to our better selves, and it's sad that it has to work that way. But I think that January 6th was a very, very bad thing, and anybody who in any way minimizes that is someone to be mistrusted, deeply, deeply mistrusted, and is either lunatic or malevolent. There's really no other thing that you can be if you minimize the significance of that. But ultimately, what it really means is yet to be known. And I would say the same thing to some degree about the presidency of Donald Trump. The fluky things happen. It was fluky that a distinct minority of the American population ended up being decisive in the selection of a president with all of the negative dimensions that Donald Trump had. And that's really disturbing, and that speaks to a weakness in our system and a vulnerability and all those kinds of things. But the fact that he then was defeated and that more people voted than had ever possibly voted is a significant thing. It's also significant that he wasn't defeated by much, and that's really frightening, and that begins to mean something. If in the next presidential election Donald Trump were to come back into office, or some other person very similar to him were to come back, then that begins to be confirmation of a really, something very, very troubling, deeply dangerous. And I've been, over the years, I've tended to be, I used to do a television show that was on most PBS stations every week, and I was doing that at the time that Donald Trump emerged and was running for president. And I defended Donald Trump a lot on that show. Early on, I said, come on, if you could subtract these, half dozen really terrible things that he said, then how much different does he really sound from a lot of other political figures? And there have been instances when media mischaracterized things that he had said. And I had journalists, friends of mine, who were on that program that I used to do, and there were a number of times that I had New York Times reporters on there. I said, you wrote this story where you said that the President Trump said this thing, and I went back and read the transcript of your interview, and he didn't actually say that. And I would push them on those things. And when the first people were saying, well, Donald Trump needs to be impeached before he had even been inaugurated, my response, very publicly, was, that's crazy talk. That we can't become a place that wants a do-over on every election, and that we just, because at that stage we had we're talking about impeaching a president who's barely even entered office, and there had been lots of stupid talk about impeaching President Obama, and then you had a little bit of talk about impeaching President Bush, who actually was the only president in recent times who actually did things that turned out badly on a scale of substance that there actually was an argument for impeachment there, but, and some people said it, you know, and then Bill Clinton, who was impeached, you know, over bad moral failure, but boy, compared to what we've seen since then. But so we can't be this society that is constantly saying, well, whoever won, if it's not my guy, he ought to be impeached. You know, that's, you know, that's a core value, the destruction of a core value. So my point in all that is that these are all dangerous things and we can't minimize them, but in the end, it's what happens next, what they add up to, that really tells us those things, and that is also the opportunity to affect it. So I think I should stop again.
Well, these matters that have been before us today certainly call for our time and attention. They are so important, and maybe even to take us to a point of discomfort with the time and attention that it takes. We know we're not finished here, but thank you. Thank you so much for helping us to invest in that through these moments with your stories, with your experiences that you can share, and with the questions you've put before us. And I know this will continue to stir in our own thinking and conversations from here. We thank you so much, Doug Blackman, for being with us and for leading us today.
Thank you. Good to be here. Great questions.